Welcome to Energy Vista, a podcast on energy issues where we make experts great again and contribute actively to the public debate and policymaking around commodities, the geopolitics of energy, and trade. I'm your host, Leslie Palti-Guzman. It's July 10, 2026, and time for a new Energy Vista episode. Today, my guest is Erica Downs, a senior research scholar at the Center for Global Energy Studies at Columbia University, CIPA, and focusing on energy markets, Chinese energy markets, and geopolitics. Erica has more than 20 years of experience working in the public and nonprofit sectors. And we actually briefly overlapped at Eurasia Group and have continued to cross paths at energy and Asia policy conferences, events over the years. And Erica has just returned from China, so I couldn't think about a better time to get her perspective and expertise on Chinese energy policy, China's role on the geopolitical energy chessboard, and actually, while the Iran war remains unresolved, I'm very curious to hear from Erica. So, hi, Erica.
Hi, Leslie. Great to see you. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming to the Energy Vista podcast. So let's dive right into the topic of the day. So China had a long-standing strategy of diversification, all the above energy, and it seems that it has been vindicated during the Iran war. So what I mean is that we've seen that China has put a lot of efforts in domestic energy production, reducing its dependence on one single exporter or maritime route, building strategic storage, diversifying imports. So, do you feel that this strategy has paid off? And more specifically, how did the Chinese economy fare during the war? Because we heard a lot, in Europe, in Southeast Asia, in the US, prices of electricity, gasoline prices. Like, how did the Chinese consumers or industries experience this price volatility?
So happy to make a few comments on those issues. I 100% agree with you that the conflict in the Middle East and China's weathering of it absolutely vindicates pretty much everything they've done to enhance their energy security for over 20 years. This includes the building, and filling of strategic and commercial oil reserves, constructing cross-border pipelines to deliver oil and natural gas from Central Asia and Russia to China, and then a strong emphasis on diversification of energy suppliers, diversification of import routes. And of course, there's also been the push to electrify everything, especially road transport. And the big bet that Beijing made on EVs, it has certainly paid off in that China has been able to avoid future oil demand growth and therefore imports by the increasing penetration of EVs in China's vehicle fleet. And of course,
In
because
between parentheses, like those EVs are powered by what kind of electricity? Coal?
I think it depends. I would say it's a mix, that there is coal involved, but also renewables.
So it's domestic coal and domestic renewable.
Yes, I would say that it's largely powered by domestic energy sources, both fossil and non-fossil.
Yeah. Okay. So at home, how did they feel the war, or they didn't really feel the war?
So I think the war has been felt, but differently by different parts of the Chinese economy. For example, if we talk about natural gas, there are some industries in China that are highly dependent on gas because of the heat content. So if you're a ceramics producer in China or a glass producer in China, and you don't have the flexibility to switch to other fuels, then the higher prices for gas are certainly going to hit you harder than perhaps a power plant in Guangdong province that if it needs and if it needs fuel for peak demand, you can switch from coal from natural gas back to coal. And in terms of one of the most interesting things for me has been, what's been going on in the oil space. We did see at the start of the war, China sort of adjust its oil prices downward. So there wasn't a complete pass through of what the refiners were paying on the international market. But Chinese consumers also showed a lot of flexibility. There's data out there that indicates that EV use went up during the war, and that makes sense, right? That if if you're a Chinese household and you have an ICE vehicle and an EV, why not? And prices at the pump are, high enough that it's not something you want to pay. Why not use your EV? During the May, holiday week at the beginning of the month, there was an increase in EV rentals. You had a lot of Chinese citizens riding on the high-speed rail network, which is something that China also has been building out for many years and allowed it to avoid oil demand growth. So overall, China has been pretty resilient in the face of this crisis.
Hmm. And should Europe, Southeast Asian countries say thank you to China? Because in a way, China helps stabilize the global energy market. And more importantly, was it intentional? So, like, if I'm thinking about LNG imports, for example,
Yeah.
was it intentional that China didn't pull, cargoes of LNG and as a result, left them available to the markets that needed it the most? Or it was just because demand was weak actually, or they had other alternatives and it was not intentional?
I would say a mix, and it depends on what energy product we're talking about. So, and all of this is driven by China's energy, supply security. And I'll start with refined oil products. One of the first things that China did after the start of the war was to, urge refineries to cut back on the export of refined products, diesel, gasoline, jet fuel, to ensure domestic fuel supply. So this was a move driven, first and foremost by China's energy security concerns, and it's consistent with China's past practice in that how much of any given oil product they export largely depends on what's going on in the domestic market. However, so while energy security was the most important driver here, it wasn't the only driver. And I say that because there was never a complete ban on oil product exports. We didn't see them go down to zero. And there are two other factors that explain that. One, of course, is China's refineries, the big state-owned refineries, wanting to export products so they could cash in on the higher margins. But there was also a bit of what I would call, good neighbor diplomacy involved in that China did continue to export to countries, especially in Asia, where they were really feeling the pain of these shortages. In the case of Australia, we did see, some lobbying to make sure that Australia would, continue to get the jet fuel that it had imported in large quantities. So with refined oil products, there's a mix of motives. When I think looking at LNG and looking at crude oil, again, I think this was really driven, primarily by the importers preferences, that there was that they simply decided that they would prefer to buy less than to sort of pay higher prices to source alternate supplies, especially ones that wouldn't necessarily be a perfect substitute for the the crudes they get from the Middle East. And so to the extent that we saw China, not buying oil, not buying as much LNG, and therefore making these supplies, available to other consumers. I don't see this being driven by altruism, although I'm sure, China is sort of happy to take the credit, to be able to ensure enhanced domestic, energy supply security, while at the same time, painting, these efforts, these purchases that China was not making of crude oil and LNG is something that China was doing to support the global energy markets and to make supplies available to consumers that found themselves in perhaps a more difficult situation.
Yeah. So in a scenario where we're going to have those on and off disruptions around the Strait of Hormuz and continuous cycle of violence, eventually there might be some greater competition, do you think, between China and the other importers?
I think well, let me back up for a minute. One of China's, greatest tools that it's recently started to deploy in managing the supply disruptions through Hormuz has been, its vast oil inventories. The start of the war, China had about 1.4 billion barrels of oil in storage, and I calculated that oil, that volume of oil would, provide China with, about 8 months of oil import coverage from the Middle East at the 2025 level. So if, China got 0 barrels from the Middle East, for this whole period of time, they could just continue to draw down supplies from their oil inventories. Now, I don't think China wants to get down to zero, and it's also worth pointing out that China's oil imports from the region, never fell to zero. I mean, if you look at Kuwait and Iraq and countries that their only way of exporting was through the Strait of Hormuz. China's imports from those countries obviously have really plummeted, but from Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which have non-Hormuz ways of exporting, and of course Iran was letting its crude oil flow uninterrupted until the U.S. Blockade. So I think
So,
that
so China right now is going to be focused on refilling its storage, which could create some competitions with other importers.
I think it's fair to say that on the refill issue, I think China's going to certainly be looking at oil prices to see, are they at a level where, they think it makes sense to refill. But again, China has the luxury of time that they have, as I mentioned before, vast quantities of oil in storage, and they can afford to wait until, the price is right for them, essentially. And so I expect they will do that. And I also expect that, they'll want to stay under the radar, to the extent that they can when it comes from refilling, because they don't want, people to say, oh, China's refilling and and have that put upward pressure on oil prices and sort of, defeat their plan to buy when prices are lower.
Right. So in May, President Trump and President Xi Jinping, they met in Beijing.
Mhm.
I'm very curious to what did they really discuss regarding the Iran war, because so China has been the largest importer of sanctioned Iranian crude,
Mhm.
but at the same time, Beijing doesn't want a nuclear Iran. Also, they are favoring an open and free Strait of Hormuz. And at the same time, also, we know that China has helped Iran with some sharing of intelligence, also some kind of dual use technology, and gives a certain military support to Iran. So many contradictions in a way in Beijing's objectives with Iran. How do you read it, and how does it impact also the future access of China to Iranian oil and gas?
So China has been trying to balance its relationships with the United States and with Iran. The relationship with the United States is clearly the more important one, but that doesn't mean that China is going to sort of completely disregard its ties to Iran. I mean, you're absolutely right. China does not want Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon. It wants to see the free flow of commerce through the Strait of Hormuz. And we have seen, China's willing to play, a role in the background. It's willing to be a facilitator, a promoter, a champion of negotiations between the United States and Iran. I'm not sure I see China doing much more than that, but and if we look at the original, in the run up to the initial date for the Trump-Xi summit, which I think was March 31st to April 2nd, I do recall hearing that China's sort of efforts in the background to encourage Iran to negotiate with the United States, did go over well with Trump. And then fast forwarding to when the summit actually, did occur, um, we know that the Iran conflict, came up. I feel like the most detailed comments that came, from the U.S. side, that after Trump boarded, Air Force One to return to the United States, he talked about encouraging, how he said to Xi that that China should buy more U.S. oil to reduce its dependence on the Strait of Hormuz. I think there were reports that this is something China expressed interest in. Of course, expressing interest is cost free, but I think that Trump went in sort of clearly, sort of wanting some help from China. I don't think it was the only goal, but it's not surprising that the basically what we got from China on this issue is wanting, yes, they want to resolve the war, yes, they want the free flow of commerce through the Strait of Hormuz, but they're limited in what they're going to do. And I wasn't expecting them to sign any new energy contracts or agree to any new deals with with the United States at this summit. Perhaps that will happen down the road, is when this board of trade gets they've been talking about gets fleshed out. But at the end of the day, yes, China is hurt by the war. It wants it to end, but it's not their war.
Yeah. So it's in a way, Beijing is very happy to have the U.S. strategically occupied and kind of depleting some of its resources, being busy with Iran in a way.
I mean, I think it's fair to say that that is a benefit for China. But I do, and obviously in general, I think you can make the case that if the U.S. is distracted by some other issue, some other part of the world, maybe it gives China some breathing room. But I do think this is a conflict that they would like to see end sooner rather than later.
And actually, so in 2023, China brokered a normalization deal between Saudi Arabia and
Mhm.
Iran. And so China was probably already concerned about the stability in the region, the access to the Strait of Hormuz. But also, I think Saudi Arabia is the main supplier for oil to China, correct?
Yes. So
Yes.
if you look at
So, so
Russia's
I mean,
the top.
there are different interests for China to have this kind of stability ongoing and promoting de-escalation in the region.
Yes, and so on the import issue, Russia's actually, was China's and still is China's largest, oil supplier. Saudi Arabia was number two, for 2025, and certainly at the beginning of this year. And Saudi is China's largest supplier in the Middle East. Looking back at the 2023, Israel Saudi Arabia discussions, I think that's sort of a great example of the type of role that China likes to play in some of these, peace
Um,
negotiations in the United States.
Iran, Saudi Arabia.
Sorry,
You
yes,
yes, yes.
yes, sorry, my mistake. Iran, Saudi Arabia. My understanding is that a lot of the heavy lifting had initially been done by Oman. I think Iraq played a role, and so China stepped in really at the last moment when a lot of the heavy lifting had already been done, and they were able to present this and present themselves as a peace broker, as a source of stability in the region. But they didn't have to do anything, or they apparently did not have to do anything that sort of jeopardized their relationship with either Saudi Arabia or Iran.
I mean, it seems to me that China is not ready to play like a big role on the global stage in terms of being the policeman of the world, and happily leaving the US being this kind of step, like trying to stabilize energy security globally.
Yeah, I think there is a reluctance to be a global policeman on the part of China. There was not any interest, and still is not any interest in using its military power to open the strait. I think even though China does have a military base, sort of in the region, in Djibouti, but for China, I think they've made clear from the start that this isn't something they wanted to do. I don't know if you recall, sort of earlier in the conflict, there were calls from people in the U.S. administration for for China to open the strait, and that was never going to happen. I don't think it's something that China it's you know per my earlier comment, it's not something that China wants to do. They don't want to be the policeman. They don't want to be responsible for global energy security in that way. But also, let's look at who initially closed the strait. It's Iran, and Iran, up until the U.S. blockade, was willing to allow its tankers to flow through uninterrupted. China's the buyer of last resort for Iranian crude, and so China, even after the war started, China was still getting, its usual volumes of supply from Iran. And of course, in recent weeks, as Iran has been, sort of mulling over, imposing a fee for ships passing through the strait, it did make a comment about how, fees were going to differ depending on how friendly a country was to Iran. So in that sense, China, if Iran does do this, China would presumably, be one of the countries that, is not paying so much for, tankers of energy destined for China.
I mean, that's very interesting because this is like one of my scenario where we could end up with two competing parallel shipping systems inside the Strait of Hormuz, where we have on one hand the Iran approved routes with a toll or friendly tolls to its allies. So it would de facto become kind of an exclusive route with you know geostrategic interests, and you can have Russia, Iran, China all using that route, and then like a more Western affiliated, US approved protected route with through the Omani passage. And it would end up kind of what we had for a while in the Red Sea, where the Houthi accommodated their allies, and we know there were backdoors agreements, between the Houthi and non-Western allies, and namely again China, Russia,
Mhm.
Iran. So those actors were able to use without any concern for their security that shipping lane.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great example. If we look back at, what was going on in the Red Sea, especially in 2024, there were calls, from, people in the United States for China to use its influence over Iran to get Iran to restrain the Houthis, from making these attacks. And that's not something that we saw. Instead we saw China, and I think Russia might have done this too, basically, brokering, sort of an arrangement with the Houthis so that they could, sail through unscathed. And there were, Chinese, ships at one point, I think, maybe military vessels, but like I'm not 100% sure on that. But the broader point is that you did have Chinese, because China had this, basically safe passage through the Red Sea, there were actors in China that, decided that they wanted to capitalize on that. And I was able to sort of find ads on the internet where they were saying, if you want to sail, safely through, the Red Sea with a Chinese escort, sign up here. So, that's an interesting, example as well. And then looking at your point about sort of, moving towards like a dual shipping system through the Strait of Hormuz made me think about, different ways we're seeing global energy markets bifurcate, especially since the start of the war in Ukraine, right? Like we have two different, shipping systems, if you will, right? There's the dark fleet, and then there's, the not dark fleet. And the sanctions that the United States, has put on Iran and Russia, and then of course, there are EU and, UK sanctions on Russia as well. This has really, shifted energy flows, especially from Russia, from west to east, and so that's another bifurcation that is taking place.
Well, in a way, what happened in Venezuela and what could happen in Iran, if we see a lifting of sanctions, on those both countries, there may have been, there will be as an end result less dark vessels, dark fleet, and dark cargoes.
Yeah, and it has some interesting implications for China because the main buyers of sanctioned crude in China are the smaller independent refineries known as teapots. Teapots operate on thin margins. They're always looking for a bargain. They're highly opportunistic crude importers. And the sanctions that we know that on Venezuelan, on Russian, on Iranian crude, sort of facilitated, discounts on these crudes because a lot of people that would have bought them in the absence of sanctions didn't want to touch them. And even within China, the big national oil companies didn't want to touch them. So if we see, we move to a world where, there are no sanctions on, Iranian, Russian, Venezuelan crude, then if those three suppliers, are no longer, seller under sanctions, then what happens to these teapot refineries? And does this actually sort of facilitate Beijing's long-standing plans to consolidate the country's refining sector in these large integrated, refining petrochemical plants along the Chinese coast?
And coming back to the US blockade,
Mhm.
did it put pressure as potentially anticipated on China and altered Chinese, behavior in some ways related to the war? Or, as you mentioned earlier, China has the luxury of time, and it didn't work to apply any pressure on China to do anything about applying its own pressure on Iran.
I think what we've seen from China is, sort of great flexibility, right? So I would say they have, in response to this question, I'd say they have the luxury of time, but they also have the luxury of flexibility, right? That they were, instead of, scrambling to buy oil at whatever the price, from other suppliers to make sure that they, had the same volumes of crude flowing to China as before the war, ditto for LNG. Instead, we just saw, for example, in the crude oil space, we've just seen China import a lot less crude. And I think the destocking also had stopped in May. Like in April, they looks like they put about 500,000 barrels per day into storage. But looking at the data that's available for May, it looks like they drew down, from their inventories by about 500,000 barrels per day. But so they had the SPR flexibility. They had the electrification of transport, so people could drive their EVs, they could ride on high speed rail, and so we just saw China, being able to make do for with less. And
Yeah.
so, in that sense, the crisis really hasn't been the disaster that many people, certainly outside of China and inside of China, might have expected on February 28th, given that up until that point, China was buying about half of its crude oil and almost a third of its LNG from producers in the Middle East, with the bulk of that transiting Hormuz.
Yeah. And there has been a lot of discussion about the de-dollarization, and this kind of, for me, I think this narrative is a little bit overstated. But there is this idea that if the US is no longer a security guarantee for the Gulf countries, and
Mm-hmm.
especially with Saudi Arabia, and that this historical arrangement, that we were pricing oil on US dollars
Mm-hmm.
because of the security arrangement between the US and Saudi Arabia, and if the petro dollar system is weakened, it does that reinforce potential yen settlement for oil transactions. And we know China had worked on that before, but do you think it's gaining more traction? And like, for me, there are still no alternative to the US, in terms of credible alternative to the US in terms of security guarantor in the region. And also, I think that I don't know if the data is up to date, but I think the Chinese yuan only accounts for 3% of global foreign exchange reserves right now. So how do you see this debate on the de-dollarization, especially for energy transactions?
So I would agree with you that if we look at the world right now, like you said, that if we look at global trade settlement, Chinese currency is just accounts for a few percent. There is no sort of market as sort of large and liquid as that of the United States, and so that makes settling for Gulf producers and elsewhere, settling in dollars attractive. There's also something sort of known as the network effect. So the more a currency is used, the more people want to use it. That works in the dollar's favor. And of course, with China, they have a it's a fairly tightly controlled capital account. So if you're, a producer in the Gulf or somewhere else, you can't necessarily count on being able to you know uh, pull out your money when you want to do that. So I think there are a lot of factors that explain why the dollar is the dominant currency for energy trade settlement. And will continue to be for some time. That being said, China does want to gradually promote the greater international use of its currency for trade settlement. I'd say it's probably had its greatest, success with sanctioned suppliers, especially Russia. That after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we did see China-Russia energy trade settlement shift, away from dollars and euros to Chinese and Russian currency, and I suspect that's probably, mostly Chinese currency. So, but I don't see that as a near-term threat to the role of the dollar as the currency that is most widely used for trade settlement. However, I think sort of the space is sort of definitely worth watching over the longer term because, excuse me, U.S. sanctions and arguably the overuse of U.S. sanctions, which I think is an argument that lots of countries around the world would make. does make, settlement in currencies other than the US dollar attractive. And I think countries will work, some countries will, want to take steps to, sort of reduce their vulnerability, but I guess bottom line is right now, the China's currency, doesn't pose a threat to the dominant role of the U.S. dollar for energy trade settlement, but certainly worth watching over the longer term.
Yeah. And it's not just yuan. I mean, it can be crypto and especially like for shadow financial networks. Yeah.
And
Um,
one thing, sorry,
Go
I was
ahead.
going to say one thing that I've been interested in is when Xi Jinping went to Saudi Arabia in December 2022, I think he made some comments about settling energy trade in China's currency, and in addition to the reasons I gave before for why this isn't happening right now. I think for a lot of the producers in the Gulf, if you're Saudi Arabia, there might be some concerns, for example, about, saying, okay, China, you can settle in the renminbi, because then does that sort of create a domino effect where, you have other major buyers, wanting to, settle trade with Saudi Arabia, or other suppliers in their own currency. But China has been playing a really big role. Excuse me, losing my voice. In the development of renewable energy technologies in Saudi Arabia. So that sort of raises the question of, okay, if we have buyers in Saudi that are using that need to pay China for solar components, for example, does that sort of create a situation when there might be a willingness to settle some trade, a small portion of trade, in China's currency, because that makes China happy, and then they do have since they are importing stuff from China, especially for their clean tech build out. Again, I don't see that as anything that's going to result anytime soon in Saudi Arabia deciding, okay, we want to we're happy to have China, pay for its oil imports in renminbi, but it's sort of one of these changes at the margins that
Yeah.
is worth watching.
Mhm. So another way to hedge also is, pipelines versus seaborne commodities. And do you think this war is going to give back another impulse and a boost behind the power of Siberia too? This is a project we've discussed for many years. And, I think it's always more for strategic and geopolitical reasons rather than commercial and economic drivers. What's your take on the latest for this pipeline?
Yeah, always happy to talk about power of Siberia too. I mean, I think the conflict in the Middle East makes the pipeline more attractive. I don't know at this point if it's made it attractive enough that Beijing is going to give it the green light. But certainly looking at this from Russia's perspective, the Middle East war, was a gift in that it sort of created the best, sort of international context that Russia has had in years for, making its case to China that this pipeline, is something that they should go ahead with, that it will enhance China's energy supply security because it's overland, it doesn't transit Hormuz, and that's what Putin, that was the message that Russia was prepared to deliver when Putin met with Xi the week after Trump had been in Beijing to meet with Xi. But I think that one of the issues here is that, sorry, that's going off. I turned off my phone, but not my watch. But I think that, but I think one of, the context for, for Russia being able to sell power of Siberia, was, arguably better than ever. But, I think that for China, one of the lessons that they're taking away from this conflict, it's actually not really a lesson. It's sort of like, sort of another vindication, is that, do they really want to be dependent on external sources of energy,
And I
and
think that if they were to import gas from the Siberia pipeline too, plus what
Mhm,
they have currently from Russia, plus LNG, their
mhm.
dependence share on gas imports from Russia will reach like something like 40%.
Yeah, and it was already 30% in 2025 if you look at pipeline gas and LNG combined. And then, of course, as you know, the 10 BCM Far Eastern Route pipeline, is scheduled to come online next year. We did see, Putin or China and Russia, within the last year agree to increase deliveries through Power of Siberia 1. So you have, a number of, so extra gas coming through there, and so, to your point, I agree with you. I mean, I think for China, they don't want to become too dependent on any one supplier. Yes, Russia, right now probably looks more attractive than, Qatar, as a gas supplier, again, because it's overland, or even the LNG cargoes that Russia sends to China, through the Northern Sea Route, for example, when it's open, those obviously aren't passing through the Strait of Hormuz. But I'm not sure that we're at a point yet where China feels that the benefits of getting 55 BCM through Power of Siberia 2, sort of outweigh the risks of becoming too dependent on any one supplier. And then I will also add, from the Russia side of things. I mean, I also think for China that in order for them to, greenlight Power of Siberia, they would have to get conditions that I'm not sure Russia would agree to, right? That I think they'd want a price that's even lower than what they're paying for gas from Power of Siberia 1. And I think they'd want a lot of flexibility in terms of how much gas, they're obligated to take at any one time, And so I think that, when I try to think of like what would make China a green light Power of Siberia 2, it would be a really low price, and it would basically be able to use the Power of Siberia 2, pipeline as a hedge, as a backup supply that, if there's a disruption, of other gas supplies to China, then they can, ramp it up, or
Give
demand
them
increases in
give them
China.
more optionality. Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm not sure I see the Russians agreeing to that. So, I don't want to say I'm 100% certain it's not going to go forward, but I think it's probably more likely not to happen than it is to happen,
Yeah.
for the reasons I've just said.
Yeah. And of course, these days we cannot not talk about AI and data centers. So it seems that China has many advantages when it comes to power its AI economy compared to the US. So it's a centralized, planned economy, state-owned companies, one long-term direction. So that helps to when it comes to build transmission lines, pipelines, large-scale infrastructure. And there is no social backlash, as far as I know, regarding data centers in China. So, where do you feel like? Um, what do you think about this competition between the US and China in terms of powering data centers and AI? Like, is there a race, and is China winning?
So I would add to, some of the issues that you just mentioned, another advantage that China has over the United States is really sort of this all of the above approach to, its electricity mix. Whereas, in the United States, certainly under, the current Trump administration, there's, a hostility, if you will, towards, renewable energy. And so I think, if you're China and you are, willing to, rely on a wide array of fuels, to meet electricity demand, and you're able to build, new capacity quickly. That I do think that gives China, in that area, I do see China as, as having an advantage for sure. Mhm.
I mean, I would make the argument that the US has also some kind of all the above energy, but a different mix. With the sturdy backbone of oil and gas, but increasingly, one day it might be nuclear, and there is still many renewables, even if there is
Mhm.
less investments being made today. I think when you go to a state like Texas or other, there are still a lot of renewable infrastructure. But I think the US has a competitive advantage when it comes to use its abundance of oil and shale gas,
Mhm.
and not becoming dependent on what makes Chinese competitive advantage, which is all this renewable tech and equipment and that they are selling to the world, right? It's like trying to find a way for the US um, to keep its competitive advantage.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that basically what we're seeing, China and the US do broadly is, capitalizing on these comparative advantages in energy, right? Like the US, speaks about energy dominance, and that energy dominance is based on fossil fuels, both used domestically and, as well as for export, as a tool for leverage in the world, and that makes sense because the U.S. has a lot of oil and gas, whereas for China, they don't have, the oil and gas abundance that China does, certainly on a per capita basis, but they, made a big bet on, on clean tech. And so when China talks about, being an energy powerhouse, that is, based in part on, this view that they have that, that the what constitutes energy security in the world is, it's shifting, away, or they see it increasingly shifting away, from control of things like oil and gas, and coal to these clean technologies. So I do think when we sort of look at China and the United States and the geopolitics of energy and the country's respective advantages and disadvantages, it's sort of ultimately rooted in what energy resources, if you will, do they have a lot of, do they control? And for the US, it's fossil fuels, and for China, it's these clean technologies.
Hmm. So does it make the Chinese energy model more appealing globally? And do you see um, you know also some kind of risk of dependence, like if you think about Europe, right? Like they want to become more autonomous and have their own sovereign and energy, and you know relying more renewable batteries, but will that make them more dependent on China?
I would say yes and yes. And let me elaborate on that. So, if we look at how China's been able to weather this energy crisis, to promote this calmness and confidence, despite the high prices and some of the physical supply shortages, then that's something that I suspect that countries, especially in Asia, um, would be interested in emulating, right? That if you're hard hit by the current, the supply disruptions that we've had, through Hormuz since February 28th, then sort of building a more self-sufficient and independent energy system is going to be attractive, and certainly China is hoping that. I mean, I think there's sort of a hope, among clean tech companies and others in China that other states will look at how well China has weathered this crisis and decide that they want to, that they want to, invest in more clean tech. They want to expand the use of non-fossil energy, and rely on China to help them do that. But at the same time, I think there are concerns in that vary sort of in their sort of intensity. around the world about becoming too dependent on Chinese clean tech. For example, one sort of high-profile example was the decision, in the UK, not to allow, sort of equipment built by a Chinese company, to be installed in offshore wind farms. And so I do think that there are countries around the world that have, concerns either because they see, from certain technologies a national security risk, or they see, opening the door and rolling out the red carpet to, Chinese EVs or solar panels will, sort of destroy, sort of, their companies that are in this space, or, that they're hoping to develop, right? Like, so one of the reasons, for example, that the Biden administration, and it had tariffs on, sort of Chinese clean tech products, is because I think there was a recognition that if there were no tariffs, if, Chinese, and American consumers were, free, that would make Chinese EVs, Chinese solar panels more attractive, to consumers in the U.S., and that would basically prevent the United States from, developing these industries. So I think there are concerns. In some countries, I think there are other parts of the world where these technologies, are really attractive and they don't quite have the same concerns. And so it does sort of, again, going back to this issue of bifurcation, and splits in global energy markets that we talked about, are we going to see, a world in which, advanced economies, developed economies stay, sort of shy away a bit from Chinese clean tech, but, sort of emerging economies that, for whom, harnessing their non-fossil, their sunshine, their wind, to, have more, to enhance access to energy, to have more affordable energy, to have more reliable energy, they might go down that route. And I also suspect there might be a different, there might be differences with respect to different technologies. But, I am sort of looking to see, will we, see bifurcation in this space?
There are increasingly more voices, like policymakers, cybersecurity researchers, that are looking into suspected Chinese influence, and bot networks, especially on social media, to kind of stoke this anti-AI sentiment in the US. And can you comment on the role maybe of China in fueling this kind of anti-American sentiment, opinion in the United States? And also, it goes along like this anti-capitalism movement that we see, and, communism is cool again.
So I haven't looked closely at the issue you just raised. I will say, sort of stepping back and, looking at this from a very high level view, based on, some work I've done at different points in my career, looking at sort of Chinese messaging abroad, looking at, different tools China has used, to put out narratives that, that ultimately benefit China. I do see this as being, consistent with that. But again, it's not something that I have investigated.
Yeah, I think it's worth watching. And of course, it's not the only reason why, some millennial Gen Z generation, or whatever they are called now, would be attracted in communism, or protest against AI data center. But I think it's worth investigating the role that China may have. Because at the end of the day, it's a competition, right? Like, there is a competition between energy model, between economic models, and, the strength of the different businesses in each country is going to matter there. The technology companies behind the AI revolution, and who is the strongest, and so on. Good. Well, Erica, it was a pleasure to discuss. We had a long conversation. So thank you so much for sharing your insight. And I'm looking forward to have you back and exchange again very soon.
Thanks for having me, Leslie. This was fun.
This is Leslie Palti-Guzman saying good day and good luck. The episode was recorded on July 10, 2026. If you like what you hear, want to support Energy Vista, discuss sponsorship, or send feedback, contact me.